Are we there? Aha. Okay. I'm kind of technologically not with it sometimes. Sometimes. Well, today we're going to be moving forward in our series entitled Journey to Freedom, based on the exodus of the nation of Israel out of captivity in the land of Egypt. When we left off last week, the Israelites were camped at the base of Mount Sinai in the southern Sinai Peninsula, and they would have been spread out across the Al-Raha Plains in the community where the community of St. Catherine's is now located. The Al-Raha Plain is the only area near the mountain that could have accommodated the Israelites with all their tents and livestock. Moses had gone up on Mount Sinai to receive the law from God, along with explicit instructions on how to construct the tabernacle and conduct worship in it. But Moses had been gone for 40 days, almost a month and a half. So the people were starting to get restless. Now, we pick up our story in Exodus chapter 32, beginning with verse 1, and here's what it says. It says, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold rings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast into the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. And afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Well, most Christians and scholars put this story down to blatant rebellion. Israelites fashioned a golden calf because they were rotten to the core. But let me explain to you why the Israelites did this. Obviously, this is the moon, okay? Specifically, it's something astronomers call the wet moon, lying on its back. This far north, we don't see these, but closer to the tropic latitudes, they get them in the months of January, February. When the ancients looked up into the night sky and they saw this image, they didn't have a clue what they were looking at. They knew nothing of spherical planets or orbital mechanics. They were ignorant of all those things. To them, every image in the night sky had something to do with the gods. The wet moon was the sign of the moon god. His name was Sin. Not to be confused with our modern word sin. Our modern word comes from the old German. But in most countries, the moon god in the Middle East was called Nanasuen. But in the Semite languages of the Sinai Peninsula, he was known as Sin. The god Sin was a big deal in the ancient world. This is his temple in Ur, also known as, if we could have that slide. Yeah, there we go. Also known as the Great Ziggurat of Ur. It was restored to this form by Saddam Hussein. You may have heard of him. Went from having the fourth largest army in the world to being the proprietor of the world's biggest junkyard. But because the wet moon of spring appears with the planet Venus between its tips, that's how it's often pictured. One of the main worship centers for the moon god Sin was an ancient city called Byzantion. This is a coin from Byzantion. The moon god Sin was the city deity. Byzantion eventually became Byzantium under the Roman Empire, which later became Constantinople under the Emperor Constantine. Much later, when the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople, they changed the name to Istanbul, which it is today. But they kept the moon and the star, and they stuck it on everything. And because theirs was an Islamic empire, the moon and star came to be adopted as the symbol of Islam. Today we find the image on the flags of most Islamic nations, as well as the summit of many Islamic mosques. That's where it came from. People in the ancient world were completely unfamiliar with the idea that there's only one true God. In their world, there were gods everywhere. They basically fell into two categories. Domain deities, like Asclepius, the god of health, the Greek god of health, and tutelary deities, which were gods of various regions. Everyone in the ancient Near East knew that the Sinai Peninsula was the region of the moon god Sin. In fact, it's likely that's where the place got its name. Sinai is how you say it in Semitic languages. Archaeologists have uncovered a site called Har Karkom in Sinai, on the Sinai Peninsula, that was the center of the worship of the moon god Sin. Now, a lot of deities in the ancient world were represented by animals. Here's the Egyptian god Horus, the falcon, and Anubis, the jackal. In fact, the ancient world had really never heard of a god who wasn't represented by some kind of an image. When the ancients looked up in the night sky at the crescent moon and they saw those two horns coming up, they drew a parallel between that and Ankoli cattle, the predominant species of the whole region. Therefore, it was entirely logical to them that the bull calf was the avatar or the embodiment of the moon god Sin. Now, let's come back to our story. Israelites had just fled captivity in Egypt, led by Moses, who's being directed by a most mysterious God. For some reason, this God had led them to the land of the god Sin, the moon god. They had just left a place called the Desert of Sin. Moses had wandered up and gone up on a mountain called Sinai, and they hadn't seen him for a month and a half. The Israelites came to the conclusion that Yahweh was simply a manifestation of the moon god Sin. You can see that in verse 5, where Aaron said, tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord. Dave mentioned this a few weeks ago. Whenever you're reading the Bible and you come across that word Lord in your Bible in capital letters, that's a translation of the word Yahweh from the original language. That's the proper name of God. That's the name that God gave to Moses. Aaron had just fashioned a golden calf to represent the moon god of Sinai, but he identified him as Yahweh. Now we can see the problem God had with this beginning in verse 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, go down because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it and have said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Now, did you catch it in there? They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them. Even though the Israelites weren't quite sure who this God was who had delivered them out of captivity, they knew better than to try to represent him in the form of an idol. God had already commanded them not to go there. He had commanded them to turn away from idolatry. Idolatry is when we decide for ourselves who God is and then we worship that distorted perception. Israelites were perceiving God as a moon deity. Meanwhile, God is the God who created billions of moons in a billion galaxies. God is infinite and all-powerful. Our moon is just a pebble in his sandbox. God is the God of all that exists. You know, do we ever stop to contemplate what that actually means? You know, we think, I'm not sure such a big God really cares about my little problems. God is infinite. He knows how many atoms are in the moon. He knows how many atoms are in the farthest star in the farthest corner of the galaxy. He knows every thought in your mind. He knows every cell in your body. He listens to billions upon billions of prayers all at once, and he hears them. This is what Scripture means when it says that nothing is impossible for God. Do we really believe that? Let me share with you a story it's going to be a little hard for me to tell, but I want you to catch the heart of this story. It took place at Christmas. We're coming up on Christmas. It took place at Christmas, 1985. Now, that's a long time ago. Some of you weren't even alive back then, but in 1985, Glenda and I had just sold everything we had, and we'd relocated our family to the city of Regina so I could attend Canadian Bible College. We had 3 children at the time. Alicia, our youngest, hadn't been born yet. But after paying for college tuitions, buying books, and forking out all the costs involved in moving, we were broke. We were beyond broke. And Christmas was on the horizon. The only consolation we had was all the other married students were just as broke as we were. Now, back in those days, if you lived in Regina and you were surviving below the poverty line, you went to the grab and run, okay? Now, any of you live in Regina in the 80s, 70s and 80s? And yeah, okay, there you go. You know where the grab and run is? Oh, yeah. Okay, the grab and run was the Sears Bargain Center. It's closed now, but if a box was damaged or a set was missing a piece or something was a little bit scuffed, Sears would toss it in the bargain center. They called it the grab and run because items were dirt cheap, and if you hesitated, there was no mercy. Someone else would grab it and run to the till. We had managed to find some really good gifts at the grab and run for my youngest son and my oldest girl. But our middle son had something more specific in mind. Now, you've heard me talk about him when we did our series on the lost art of lament. He's the one who passed away in a workplace accident a few years ago. His name is Jesse. He lives with the king now. But at the time when he was 4 years old, in some store somewhere, he had seen a Fisher-Price zoo playset. And it was all he could talk about. In his mind, it was the Holy Grail. They don't make it anymore, but 40 years ago, this thing was $30. Might as well have been $30,000. It was quite simply unaffordable to us at the time. And getting this thing for him for Christmas was an impossibility. After what must have been 20 conversations with him about this Fisher-Price zoo, he finally resigned himself to the fact that no matter how much faith he had that he was going to get this treasure, it wasn't going to happen. He rationalized his disappointment by explaining to everyone he met that this was a rich kid's toy. Okay? Only rich kids got toys like this, and unfortunately, not everyone was rich. Well, you can kind of guess where this was going. A week into December, I got an invite from Christianity Today magazine to cover for an author who was booked to present a breakout workshop at a writers' conference they were holding in Regina. Somehow they found out that I wrote mountain climbing guides before I enrolled in Bible college, and I'd won some awards for them. So in their minds, they were able to connect bears and backpacks with Christian writing. okay? Not sure what the logic was. They probably couldn't get the guy who wrote Hallmark gift cards, but they invited me to fill in, okay? So it's always nice to be someone's last resort. The workshop was only a half an hour long, but the honorarium was $100. The moment I finished my presentation and they handed me the check, went straight to the bank, cashed it, and I bought that Fisher-Price Zoo playset. Now, I'm 71 years old. I've had a lot of fulfilling moments in my life, but that was probably one of my favorites. Jesse ran after, he went ballistic when he got it. He ran up to me and gave me a big hug, and he said, "Dad, are we rich?" I said, I can remember I told him, I said, "More than you can imagine." But here's the deal. Here's what I want you to catch in this story. I had an epiphany on that Christmas morning in 1985. I had an awakening that changed the way I perceived God from that moment on. On that day, I had a sudden realization that my God was too small. The way I was viewing God was too small. I was worshiping a golden calf. I was deciding for myself who God was, and I was worshiping that distorted perception. Because of the love I had for my son, I would have done anything to have given him the gift that his heart desired. There wasn't anything I wouldn't do for that little boy. Without hesitation, I would have given my life for him. And I was nothing but a poor reflection of my Father in heaven. Here I was serving an infinitely powerful, infinitely loving God and falling for the lie that there were things that he just didn't want to do for me. That there were blessings that he just didn't want to give me. Jesus once said, "You may ask me for anything in my name and I will do it." We really struggle with that verse because we can't get it to work. We can't get it to work because we've decided for ourselves who God is, and we're bowing down to that distorted perception. Our perception of God is too small. I want to read an incredibly revealing conversation that Moses had with God just before he descended the mountain to confront the people of Israel with their idolatry. Beginning in verse 9, we read, "I have seen these people," the Lord said to Moses, "and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. He said, "Lord, why should your anger burn against your people whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever." Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. Can you see what's happening here? Moses was asking God to change his mind. This is how prayer works. We're always asking God to change his mind. If we don't ask, he's not going to do it. Jesus made that clear. You do not have because you do not ask, he said. God wants us to participate in his kingdom. He wants us to act like his children. But what we really need to see in this passage is what Moses based his appeal on. He didn't put his faith in his own desired outcome, what he wanted. He didn't put his faith in the argument that it was, somehow reasonable that the Israelites had made this error. He didn't even put his faith in God's great capacity to forgive, because apparently God wasn't feeling particularly forgiving at that moment. Instead, Moses put his faith in who God is. God had made a promise to the Israelites, and Moses knew that a loving, infinite, all-powerful God would not break his promise. Are we getting this? There are over 7,000 promises of God in the Bible. If, for example, God calls us to be generous. We agree. We go, okay, yeah, we're supposed to be generous. But then we kind of qualify as infinite nature with these little counter arguments. Well, you can't give in order to get. I get where that's coming from, but it kind of diminishes the promises of God. It creates a lesser perception of who God really is. God says, test me in this and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have room for it. I think there's some getting in there. Jesus said, give and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, poured into your lap. There's a pretty clear getting element in that. These are promises. These are who God is. But we'd rather worship a golden calf, a lesser God, who we can't believe to keep his promises because we can't see who he really is. Our perception of God is too small. You know, Isaiah 53:5 tells us that by his wounds we are healed. But somehow we struggle with mustering the faith to believe he will heal us. We have trouble trusting him to be at least as loving as that father back in 1985 who would do anything to give good gifts to his children, who would lay down his life for his son. And even after God did that, even after he proved his infinite love for us, we still struggle to see who he is. Our God is too small. You know, I've listened to 100 sermons on this passage over the years. Everyone is focused on not having idols in your life, not having things that compete with God. But it's not really about that at all. It's about not having a diminished perception of who God is. You know, we look down our noses at the Israelites at the foot of Mount Sinai, but this story in the Bible isn't for them. Too late for them. It's there for us. You know, many of you have sensed that this church of ours, this awkward collection of sinners and saints, is pregnant with expectation. You know, we've seen healings and deliverances and changed souls and, you know, people snatched from the hand of the enemy. And, you know, there's an ever-thinning barrier here that I believe when it breaks, the fire of the Spirit's going to fall. And I believe we're going to know what the word revival really means. And I pray for that every day. And I invite you to join me in making that part of your daily prayer. This isn't business as usual. Something very special is building here. But one thing remains, we need to put away our golden calf God. We need to put away our lesser perception of God. We need to see him as Ezekiel did, seated on a glowing sapphire throne, bathed in fire, surrounded by a rainbow of radiance. We need to see him like Isaiah did, high and lifted up with his train of his robe filling the temple. And when we begin to grasp who this infinite God of ours really is, then we'll understand who we really are, who God has called us to be. You know, as Peter put it, a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. And we'll have the confidence to lay hold of the authority he's given to each of us. And we will come to expect great things from God. And we will have the faith to attempt great things for him. Faith is not the belief that certain outcomes will come to pass. Faith is the unshakable confidence in who God is. Well, we're going to move into our response time now. This is where we sing our praises to God, led by our worship team, if you guys will come up. And we partake together as citizens of that great kingdom in the emblem of our King's sacrifice and love on the cross, the bread symbolizing his body, the cup symbolizing his shed blood. And if we desire, we spend a few moments considering what God is trying to tell us through his word. Our communion servers will be standing at the front here. During the first song, I want to invite you to come up, receive the elements, return to your seat, and partake whenever you feel ready. The bread in the small cup is gluten-free for those who have need of it. If you'd like someone to pray for with you, you can make your way over to our prayer room, these doors at the side here. At any time after we celebrate the Lord's Supper together, our prayer ministries team will be there. They'd love to meet with you and pray with you and for you. The door will be closed. That's only to keep the noise down. Just open it up and head right in. Once everyone has shared in the communion, members of our hospitality team will receive the morning's offering. And you can also give in the foyer at the kiosk or online. Push the donate button, I think, on the web page. But for now, let's worship God together.